Iran just lost the one weapon that kept an entire region afraid of them for 30 years, and almost nobody is talking about what that actually means. Look, I need you to understand what just happened here because this is bigger than any single headline you scrolled past this morning. For 3 decades, Iran built its entire national defense strategy around one simple idea. If you cannot beat the United States or Israel in a straight fight, you build so many missiles hidden so well that nobody dares to attack you in the first place. That was the whole plan. And it was never cheap. Iran poured enormous amounts of money, engineering talent, and political capital into this one project year after year. Even while ordinary Iranians dealt with sanctions, inflation, and isolation from most of the world. The idea was simple but brutally effective. Bury the launchers underground, hide them inside mountain tunnels, scatter them across the country so that no single strike, no matter how powerful, could ever wipe out the whole arsenal at once. For a long time, it worked exactly as intended. It kept enemies cautious. It gave Iran leverage in every regional standoff. That missile stockpile was never just sitting quietly in storage somewhere. It was the backbone of Iran's entire foreign policy. The one card Tehran could always play when everything else failed. This was not a strategy Iran stumbled into by accident. It was built deliberately based on studying exactly how other countries had lost their own missile forces in past wars and building something that was supposed to never repeat those same mistakes. And we are going to come back to that history in a moment because it explains almost everything about why this current moment matters so much. Since the war between Iran, the United States, and Israel began at the end of February 2026, that backbone has been hit again and again. And one specific detail from these strikes deserves way more attention than it has gotten, because it may represent a genuine turning point in how modern wars against hidden weapons are actually fought. According to the Pentagon's own public statements, during the opening phase of what the American military named Operation Epic Fury, U.S. forces used a weapon most people had never even heard of before this war. It is called the Precision Strike Missile, or PrSM for short, and it made its first ever combat appearance during these strikes on Iran. Here is what makes this genuinely different from the kind of strikes people are used to hearing about. When most of us picture a major American strike operation, we picture stealth bombers slipping through enemy airspace in total darkness, or Navy destroyers sitting far offshore, launching missiles from the safety of open water. The Army has traditionally stayed in the background of stories like this. It holds ground. It protects supply lines. Long-range precision strikes deep into enemy territory were always someone else's job, usually handled by the Air Force or Navy, while the Army focused on the fight closer to the front lines. Not this time. According to General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was a U.S. Army artillery unit firing from HIMARS launchers that used the PrSM to strike deep inside Iranian territory. The specific unit involved, the 3rd Battalion of the 27th Field Artillery Regiment, had been trained and equipped for exactly this kind of mission, but had never actually used this particular missile in real combat before this war began. This was not a small footnote buried somewhere in a defense briefing. This was a brand new weapon system proving itself for the very first time in real combat on one of the most heavily defended battlefields on the planet. PrSM is not just a small upgrade to the older missile system that came before it. It is a completely different generation of weapon built specifically to fly farther, hit with more precision, and destroy exactly the kind of target Iran has spent decades learning to hide. Hardened underground bunkers, mobile launchers that never sit still, threats that vanish the moment someone spots them on a screen. Engineers reportedly even began developing a version of this same missile, capable of hitting moving ships at sea, something the Army had wanted for years, but had never fully fielded until this exact conflict forced the issue. But here's the part of the story that should really make you stop and think. Hitting a missile launcher is not actually the hardest part of an operation like this. Finding it is. Iran's missile launchers are mobile by design. They move constantly on purpose, following patterns built specifically to frustrate anyone trying to track them. They hide under camouflage netting stretched across open fields. They disappear into tunnels carved deep into mountains. This was never guesswork on Iran's part. It was a deliberate, carefully engineered survival strategy, built entirely around one core assumption. No enemy, no matter how advanced, could reliably track and destroy a weapon that never stayed in the same place for more than a few hours. To hit a moving target before it moves again, you need something most people never really think about when they picture modern warfare. You need intelligence. And not just any intelligence. You need real-time, constantly updating information, pulled from satellites, from signals interception, from human sources working quietly on the ground, and from drones patiently watching a single patch of desert for hours. All of that has to come together into one coherent picture, fast enough that commanders can actually strike before the target disappears. Again, that kind of capability is not something any country builds in a single year. It is something the United States has spent decades quietly refining, largely without public attention. And what happened over those opening days of the war, if the reporting holds up, is some of the clearest evidence we have seen that this system has matured into something genuinely dangerous for anyone relying on hiding their weapons to survive. Now, picture what that actually means going forward. For decades, constant movement meant safety for Iran's missile forces. It meant survival. If this capability really works the way early reports suggest, movement alone may no longer be enough to guarantee that survival. Let's talk now about how American forces even managed to strike this deep into Iranian territory in the first place. Because on paper, Iran's air defenses were never supposed to make an operation like this easy. Over the past decade, Iran invested heavily in building one of the most layered air defense networks anywhere outside of Russia and China. Long-range systems developed domestically, working alongside older Russian-supplied interceptors, were specifically designed to turn Iranian skies into a serious danger zone for enemy aircraft. This was never a weak, outdated system. It was a real purpose-built shield, and Iran had spent years reinforcing it, expecting it to matter exactly in a moment like this one. So the obvious question becomes, how did American and Israeli forces get through it? The honest answer is that we do not know every detail with certainty, but based on how operations of this scale are typically built, the most likely explanation involves several things happening together. Direct strikes on radar installations and command centers before the main wave of attacks ever crossed into Iranian airspace. Electronic warfare jamming and confusing Iran's ability to see incoming threats on its own screens. And very likely, cyber operations quietly disrupting parts of the network from the inside before a single missile from the main strike package was ever fired. We already have real evidence of just how badly Iran's broader military position was damaged in these opening days. In the first 10 days of Operation Epic Fury alone, American forces reported destroying 50 Iranian naval vessels using a combination of artillery, aircraft, and sea-launched missiles. Satellite images later showed one of Iran's largest naval support ships, a vessel used as a floating base for smaller boats and helicopters, burning at its own pier in the port of Bandar Abbas after being struck while moored. A submarine was also reported sunk during the same period. These are not small symbolic losses. Ships and submarines like these take years, sometimes decades, to design, build, and replace. Losing them in the opening days of a war is the kind of setback that reshapes a Navy's capability for a generation, not just for the length of a single conflict. Now let's step back and talk about why all of this matters far beyond Iran's own coastline. Because this is genuinely where the story becomes much bigger than most casual observers realize. Iran's missile program was never only about defending Iranian territory. It was the engine running underneath almost everything Iran did across the entire region. The rockets aimed at Israel during periods of escalation, the drone attacks on shipping lanes in the Red Sea, the massive arsenal held by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, the rocket stockpiles inside Iraq and Syria, controlled by allied militia groups. All of it traces back directly or indirectly to the very missile program that has now absorbed some of the most serious damage it has ever faced. Analysts often call this entire structure the axis of resistance, a sprawling network of allied forces across multiple countries, all of them ultimately backed by one implicit, unspoken threat. If you strike Iran too hard, or strike one of its allies too hard, Iran retains the ability to hit back in a serious, painful way. That threat only works if everyone in the region genuinely believes Iran can follow through on it. And it only works as long as Iran's own leadership believes the same thing about itself. If Iran's missile capability really has been degraded anywhere close to what the early reporting suggests, that entire threat structure becomes weaker. Not gone completely, but weaker in a way that changes how every actor across this region calculates risk, starting from right now. I want to pause here and give you some real historical context, because history has a habit of humbling even the most impressive-sounding military operations. Back in 1991, during the opening phase of the Gulf War, the United States launched what later became known as the Great Scud Hunt, an enormous, exhausting effort to find and destroy Iraq's mobile missile launchers scattered across the western desert. It remains one of the most intense targeting campaigns in modern military history. And despite everything thrown at it, every aircraft, every intelligence asset, every special operations team hunting on the ground, it never fully succeeded. Iraq kept launching missiles almost right up until the war ended. The mobile launchers proved extraordinarily difficult to permanently track down. That painful lesson shaped how every serious military planner has thought about this problem ever since. Mobile targets are genuinely brutally hard to kill, and that difficulty is exactly why Iran built its own missile program around the twin principles of mobility and dispersal in the first place. Iranian planners studied that same 1991 history closely. They built their entire strategy around the confident belief that what happened to Iraq's arsenal would never happen to their own, because at the time the technology needed to solve that problem simply did not exist yet anywhere in the world. Interestingly, this was not even the first time in recent years that Iran's missile production capability had been targeted. Back in October 2024, Israeli airstrikes on Iran reportedly damaged Iran's missile production capability and destroyed long-range air defense systems, according to American and Israeli officials at the time, though Iran downplayed the extent of that damage. So this current war did not start from a position where Iran's defenses were untouched. It started from a position where cracks had already been showing for more than a year, and this new campaign appears to have widened those cracks dramatically. What appears to have happened during these opening weeks of the current war strongly suggests that the mobility problem, the one that defeated the world's most powerful militaries back in 1991, may have finally been solved, or at least solved well enough to shift the entire strategic calculation for the first time in decades. If that description turns out to be accurate, this is not just another airstrike campaign to file away alongside dozens of others from the same war. It is the result of literal decades of quiet, patient effort spent fixing the exact weakness that allowed Iraq's missiles to survive intact back in 1991. That is the kind of shift that matters for every country on Earth that has built its defense strategy around the comforting idea that hiding your weapons and moving them constantly is enough by itself to keep them safe. And here is something worth sitting with, because it reaches far beyond just Iran. Every country that has built its own missile or nuclear deterrent around the same core idea, hide it, move it constantly, is watching this exact story unfold right now, whether they say so publicly or not. North Korea has built much of its arsenal around mobile launchers hidden in mountain tunnels. Pakistan has done something similar with parts of its own forces. Even larger powers like Russia and China study every American strike campaign closely, looking for exactly this kind of capability, because it tells them something important about what their own hidden systems could and could not survive if a real conflict ever broke out. If the problem that defeated the Great Scud Hunt back in 1991 has genuinely been solved, or even mostly solved, that is not just bad news for Iran sitting alone in isolation. That is a signal being read carefully right now in military planning rooms far beyond the Middle East. Now, I want to talk about the actual people behind all of this, because it becomes very easy to get lost in weapon systems and grand strategy and quietly forget that real human beings carried this entire operation out with their own two hands. Somebody flew into some of the most heavily defended sky on the planet, fully aware that a single mistake could end their life instantly. Somebody sat behind a HIMARS launcher for hours, trusting intelligence data they had no way to personally verify at the moment, trusting that the coordinates they had been handed were accurate, down to the meter. Somebody spent months, quite possibly years, quietly building the intelligence picture that made this operation even possible, patiently piecing together fragments of raw information into a target list precise enough to actually act on. None of that level of coordination happens by accident. It happens because of relentless training, endless rehearsal, and tight coordination across military branches that do not always work this closely together. Whatever your personal opinion happens to be about the politics behind this entire war, that part of the story deserves real respect. It is easy to sit behind a screen and debate strategy in the comments. It is a completely different thing to be the person actually pulling the trigger, actually carrying the weight of a decision that cannot be undone once it is made. But we also have to be honest about something else, something that gets far less attention than the impressive parts of this story. War like this does not stay clean, no matter how precise the technology becomes. On the 28th of February, the same day this war began, a sports hall in the southern Iranian town of Lamers was struck by a two-missile attack while a women's volleyball team was using the facility. At least 21 people were killed, including 4 children. More than 100 others were injured. Weapons experts who later reviewed the footage, including analysis published by the New York Times, said the strike appeared consistent with a PrSM attack, the very same weapon system this entire story revolves around. American officials publicly disputed the specific circumstances of what happened. That single event is a reminder that behind every phrase, like precision targeting or coordinated strike, there are real families whose lives were shattered in an instant. Families who had nothing to do with missile programs or military doctrine, who were simply inside a building on an ordinary afternoon. Any honest account of this war has to hold both truths at once. The military capability on display here is genuinely remarkable, and the human cost of that same capability when things go wrong is devastating and real. This tension between capability and cost is not unique to this one incident either. Throughout the opening weeks of the war, Iranian retaliation caused its own share of suffering across the region. Strikes on Kuwait damaged power infrastructure and destroyed military equipment. Missiles and drones aimed at Saudi Arabia struck oil facilities, and in at least one case, hit a residential building, killing civilians. Projectiles crossed into Jordanian airspace, requiring interception by Allied forces. War like this rarely stays confined to the two main combatants. It spreads outward unpredictably, touching countries that never asked to be part of it. Now let's talk about what Iran can actually realistically do in response, because this is the question everyone watching is really asking. I want to be completely straightforward with you here. Nobody can predict with total certainty what Iran's leadership decides to do next. Anyone online telling you they know exactly what happens with full confidence is simply guessing. But we can look closely at the realistic set of options still available to Iran, because those options appear to have gotten noticeably smaller. If Iran's ballistic missile capability really has been degraded anywhere close to what current reporting suggests, Iran cannot respond in exactly the same way it has responded before in this conflict. A large-scale sweeping missile retaliation requires exactly the kind of deep, reliable stockpile that has reportedly absorbed heavy sustained damage. Whatever missiles Iran genuinely has left in reserve are now precious, scarce, and far more likely to draw an even harder response if used carelessly. What remains available to Iran are its other tools: proxy attacks carried out through allied groups scattered across the region, drone strikes launched from various locations, harassment campaigns targeting shipping traffic moving through the Gulf. We have already seen versions of this play out since the war began, with Iranian strikes hitting American and allied positions in Kuwait, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and Iranian forces losing multiple aircraft and drones in the exchanges that followed. These remain very real threats, capable of causing genuine damage and disruption. But none of them, individually or combined, carry the same strategic weight that a direct, large-scale ballistic missile threat carried for so many years. They can create chaos and real headlines, but they cannot fully recreate the deep deterrent power Iran appears to be losing in real time. There is also an important domestic angle here that is easy to overlook when you are watching this story purely from the outside. Iran's leadership has spent decades building its legitimacy at home, especially among its most hardline supporters, on a carefully cultivated story of strength and resilience. The missile program sat right at the center of that national story. A serious, confirmed blow to that program is not just a military setback measured in destroyed equipment. It is a direct hit to the very narrative Iran's leadership has told its own citizens for years. How that gets managed internally, whether through loud, defiant rhetoric, quiet rebuilding kept out of public view, or some mixture of both, is going to shape Iranian politics for a long time to come. Let's zoom out further, because the ripple effects from all of this reach far beyond Iran's own borders, touching countries across the entire region. For years, Israel has lived under the looming threat of large-scale missile barrages launched from Iranian territory. We saw exactly how serious that threat was during earlier rounds of direct conflict between the two countries. Enormous national resources went directly into missile defense systems, and real fear spread through Israeli cities during those attacks. If the underlying source of those barrages has genuinely been crippled the way current reporting describes, Israel's entire strategic position shifts. Resources that were locked into missile defense can potentially be redirected elsewhere. That is not a small change to gloss over. It reshapes how Israel approaches every other front it is dealing with across the region. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have faced their own version of this threat, mostly channeled through Iran-backed Houthi forces operating out of Yemen, armed and guided using Iranian missile technology and expertise. Strikes during the same war already hit Saudi territory directly, including attacks on oil infrastructure and American positions stationed there, with reported American casualties among the forces defending against those attacks. If the underlying source of that support and technology has genuinely been damaged by this operation, the overall threat picture facing Gulf states could look meaningfully different within the coming months. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth thinking through carefully, and it has nothing to do with missiles or radar systems directly. It has to do with money, oil, and the global economy sitting quietly in the background of this entire story. A huge part of the tension surrounding Iran for years has revolved around the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow shipping lane that a massive share of the world's oil supply has to pass through every single day. Iran has repeatedly used the threat of closing that strait or harassing tankers moving through it as leverage whenever tensions with the West escalated. That threat was always backed, at least in part, by the same broader military capability we have been discussing throughout this video. A weakened missile and strike capability does not necessarily stop Iran from using naval mines or fast attack boats to threaten shipping, but it does change how confident Iran can be that it can escalate that kind of confrontation without facing a devastating response it can no longer properly deter against. Markets already understand this, even if they rarely say it directly. Oil prices tend to spike within hours of any major escalation involving Iran, then slowly settle once traders get a clearer picture of what actually happened on the ground. Watching how oil futures and shipping insurance premiums move over the coming weeks will tell you more about how seriously professional analysts are taking this story than almost any political statement will. Shipping companies rerouting vessels, insurers adjusting their premiums for tankers moving through the Gulf. These quiet, unglamorous decisions made by people whose entire job is pricing risk often reveal the truth long before any government makes an official statement about it. None of this guarantees any particular outcome. These are simply the honest signs worth tracking if you actually want to understand where this conflict is heading, instead of reacting emotionally to whichever headline leads the news on a given day. Before I wrap this up, I want to say one thing plainly, because it matters. None of this is about cheering for either side to suffer more or celebrating a war that has already cost real lives on multiple sides of this conflict. It is about refusing to accept a comforting headline just because it feels good to hear, when the actual facts on the ground, the strikes, the casualties, the shifting balance of power, are telling a far more complicated story underneath it. Understanding that gap is not cynicism. It is simply paying attention. So, where does all of this leave us? Iran spent 30 years building a shield made of distance, mountains, and constant movement, betting that no enemy could ever solve the problem that defeated the world's most powerful militaries back in 1991. For a long time, that bet paid off. It kept the region cautious. It kept Iran's leadership feeling untouchable in at least one domain, even while everything else around them grew more fragile. What appears to have happened over these opening weeks of this war suggests that bet may no longer be safe. Not because Iran ran out of missiles entirely, not because the threat has vanished completely, but because the single assumption an entire national defense strategy was built on, the belief that hiding and moving is enough, may have finally met a system patient enough and precise enough to prove that assumption wrong. That is not a small story limited to one country and one region. It is a preview of what every government on earth that has bet its own security on the same idea is quietly being forced to confront right now, whether they admit it publicly or not. And somewhere behind every dry sentence in a Pentagon briefing and every satellite photo of a burning ship or a destroyed depot, there are real families on every side of this war who spent recent nights not knowing where their son, daughter, husband, or wife actually was, or whether they would hear their voice again. That is the part of every war story that rarely makes it into the confident, fast-paced headlines. And it is worth remembering every single time a story like this one breaks that behind the impressive technology and the sweeping strategic analysis, there are still just people on every side trying to survive something none of them chose. This story is still moving. The next chapter may reveal just how much of what we think we know right now turns out to be only half the picture. And I will be here breaking it down when it does.